For more on this, joining me from Ottawa, Roland Paris, a professor at the University of Ottawa and former foreign policy advisor to Justin Trudeau. In Washington, Laura Dawson, director of the Canada Institute and a former advisor on economic affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa. Good to see you both. Appreciate it.
Hi.
So Merkel's agenda is, sort of typical classic Merkel stuff, and you can understand why some G20 leaders will want to talk about those things, but not everybody. So Roland, I'll start with you. What is she up against here in trying to get people like Donald Trump to talk about protectionism, climate change, mass migration? Is this really going to be the focus of this meeting?
Well, I think it's going to be extremely difficult to reach agreement, especially on climate change and on trade issues, where the Trump administration is really in a very different space than Merkel and most of the other G20 members. On climate change in particular, they're so far apart, and the dilemma is that they can negotiate language which will kind of bridge the differences between the United States and the rest of the G20, but the result will be mush. And it will be weak, and that will be problematic for most of those leaders who want to reaffirm their commitment to implementing the Paris Climate Accord. Alternatively, they could do what they did at the G7 in June and kind of have a U.S. dissent from the main agreement of the summit. But that's problematic too, not least because a few other countries that have been wavering on their commitment to the Paris Agreement might decide to join with the United States. So it's going to be a tricky balancing act for her.
And that's why our Prime Minister, Laura, said that he did want to see some clear language on the Paris Agreement inside the final communique. I mean, we all know these things have been hashed out in advance, but do you agree with Roland that probably will be the hardest area to reach some sort of consensus?
There's so many hard areas to reach. I don't see any areas where we can say, oh, they've got consensus on that. I think climate is going to be extraordinarily difficult. At the same time, that's a place where I think there's some room to maneuver with the Trump agenda. There's certainly been a lot of American interest groups coming forward saying we support the Paris climate commitments, even if the president has backed away. So actually, I don't see climate as being the most problematic, or I see everything being quite problematic. And the trade and economic stuff is going to be very difficult as well.
Well, it just seems crazy to me that one of the main themes is, anti-protectionism and globalization, and somehow you have to discuss these with Donald Trump at the table. I mean, how do you have that conversation with a guy that is moving completely in the opposite direction, Roland?
Well, I usually agree with Laura. I'm not sure I agree with her entirely this time. I think that the trade issues will be actually easier to fudge in this agreement. They can use language about fair trade. I don't see the bridging on climate and reaching a consensus that really has a strong commitment to implement the Paris Agreement, which so many of the G20 leaders have committed themselves to. But whether it's trade or climate, I mean, the big question here is whether the G20 itself is going to experience a rupture, or whether there's going to be a means of carrying on. And it's important that the G20 carry on for a lot of different reasons, including the fact that there are countries at the table, developing countries and developed countries, that are going to have to meet and keep on talking about these issues as the world is undergoing these remarkable changes. So coming out without a rupture might be the best that we can hope for here.
So, go ahead, Laura. Yeah.
I was just saying, and I think coming up with decisions and conclusions at this meeting, that's far too much to hope for. But I think people are there trying to figure out which way the wind is blowing, which way the weather is going, and whether there is, say, a consensus among countries that aren't the United States towards greater globalization in trade and economics and financial inclusion. One of the things we know about Donald Trump is he will change his mind. If he sees a parade that he wants to get out in front of, he probably will make that shift. So that's one of the, I think, positive things in that president's favor.
Okay, the person that maybe could act as some sort of bridge, while we're talking about bridges here, is our guy, is the Prime Minister. We're talking a lot about Trump. Putin will be there too, and he's his own ball of wax and difficult to deal with. But Roland, what is the likelihood that Trudeau could play that role of sort of reaching out to Trump to make sure he doesn't feel isolated and helping him get to a place where maybe he can talk to other world leaders?
Well, I think our Prime Minister goes into this meeting with a number of goals. I mean, the first one is to present a strong case for his priorities, including open international trade, including implementation of the Paris Agreement, including women's rights and empowerment. That's an emerging priority within his foreign policy. At the same time, coming to your question, he might have an opportunity to play something of a bridging role, at least to try and build consensus around the table. He seems to have credibility with President Trump. He certainly does with our European allies. I don't expect a lot to come out of this summit, but again, avoiding a rupture would be an accomplishment in itself. And then finally, of course, you know, we think about these summits, you look at them from the outside, and there are these big meeting tables, and those are the main summit sessions. But it's a kind of carnival of side bilateral diplomacy that's taking place all the time. So the Prime Minister will have a number of meetings with other leaders, and he will be advancing Canada's foreign policy agenda. I would expect him to meet with some European leaders. He will be pushing hard for the quick coming into force of the Canada-EU trade agreement. He might meet with the Mexican president to coordinate on NAFTA. He might have an opportunity to meet with Trump, in which case he'll certainly want to be talking about a NAFTA as well. So if I were advising the PM, those would be the three areas that I think that he'd focus on. I expect that that's what he's going to be doing.
Okay, Laura, last word to you on that.
Yeah, something he's been doing extraordinarily well is playing that balance between wingman for President Trump, trying to ease the way, trying to help ease Trump's passage into, a good diplomatic position, as well as standing up for Canada's interests internationally. That's tough. I mean, we have to remember that Canada's interests economically anyway are really tied into the U.S. You can't afford to alienate that guy.
Let me just ask you one last question about Putin. Can you alienate Putin? And is that okay if they do that?
That's Roland's question.
For me, well, I would say that to me, the most important thing about this entire summit is the meeting between Trump and Putin. They haven't met before. We do not know how that's going to go. Trump has sent so many mixed signals. We don't know if he's going to raise a Russian interference in the U.S. election. We don't know if he's going to be firm with Putin. We don't know if he's going to be conciliatory. We know, though, that Trump puts a lot of stock in these personal meetings, and there have been occasions in the past, first meetings between presidents, U.S. presidents and Russian leaders that have set the tone for the ongoing relationship. So I think people are going to be watching that extremely closely.
I know everyone thinks that they've met and they're best buddies because of the way that Trump talks, but that's not in fact the case. And this could establish what the relationship is going forward.
I've seen their pictures together. You think that's photoshopped? I thought that was real news.
Well, this is different now. All right. Thank you both. I appreciate it very much. Roland Paris, Laura Dawson. Thanks.
Thanks.